All right, we were on roughly page 17 of the manual, moved over on about 18. Still kind of a history and gives you some details. There's some things here that you would see that I didn't mention necessarily. When Dr. Lake actually started the International Apostolic Council back in 1914, then he got the idea. He had visited London, or visited England, put it that way, and he'd gotten an idea of, he'd been around this place. It was a deal called the International Pentecostal Council, and actually Wigglesworth had been kind of not necessarily a member of it, but he went there regularly when they had meetings. And Dr. Lake saw that, and when he got back, he decided to start a group he called the International Apostolic Council. And that was in, like I said, early 1914, actually before he went to the Hot Springs, Arkansas meeting with the Assemblies of God. And so he started that, and that is actually the ministry name that's been passed down. John Lake never used the name John G. Lake Ministries. And so the actual name of the ministry was the International Apostolic Council. And so we have continued that on. And now, to give you a little quick kind of an update also, try to give you several of the details there. Give you some other details on page 19, talks about some of the other aspects and names and places that they were. Then on page 21, I believe it is, there is a brief history of the John G. Lake Healing Rooms. That'll give you the actual history of what took place there and what happened. Now, one of John Lake's children from his second marriage was one of his daughter's name was Gertrude, and Gertrude was one of the children that actually seemed to really take a lot of interest in the ministry and what took place, and she and her father were probably closer than he and the other children. And I've gone up to the area now. Gertrude eventually married. There was a man that came into the Spokane area back in, actually it was in 1931, I think it was. Yeah. Well, he sat under Dr. Lake's ministry from 31 to 35, but then they married in 1941. And so when they married, they started gathering all of the material from Dr. Lake and started keeping everything together and trying to keep a history of things. And so they kind of carried the ministry on. The difference was their emphasis wasn't on healing the way Dr. Lake's was. And so their ministry was more along the lines of intercessory prayer. And so that's pretty much what they taught on. Actually, there was a video, I have a copy of it, from years ago when Billy Brim did a meeting in Los Angeles. And it was an intercessory prayer meeting. And she had both Gertrude and Wilford teaching at that meeting. And so if you ever get a chance to see that, I don't know if you can get that from Billy Brim anymore or not, but you can actually hear them and see them speaking at that time. Now, from at that point, as I said, Dr. Lake passed away in 1935, September 16th. But about a year and a half before that, he was actually preaching one night. It was on May 24th, I think it was a Thursday. It was May 24th of 1934. And Dr. Lake was talking about some things where they had planned the church to go and kind of where they were moving into. And he had actually planned to start a Bible school and had already got everything around, was heading that direction. Had already had over, I think, 200 students enroll for the beginning at the end of that year. And while he was in the midst of kind of saying where they were going, he began to prophesy. And as he prophesied, he started talking about who would pick up the ministry and who would carry it on. And so that was on, and it should be, actually I think, yep, there it is. On page 23, it actually says this. And it gives the prophecy that he gave from the family. I got this from the family later on. Now, what happened with us is that, in the way we came into the ministry, was that I was actually born in 1959, April 1st, 1959. I'm 53, I'll be 54 in a couple of months. That way you're not sitting there trying to figure it out. So just go ahead and tell you. So you try to figure it out and you'll miss the rest of the stuff I'm trying to say in the meantime. But when I was born, shortly, my parents were both very young. I was an only child, still an only child, and my mother was not supposed to be able to have children, and then she had me, which was quite a surprise to them apparently. It was an April Fool's joke apparently too. So I don't know, but I was born, like I said, April 1st, 1959. Then 17 months later, in September of 1960, we were at a family reunion, and I was up, walking around, that kind of stuff. And my dad, and we had a fairly large family there, and my dad went out to the car to go somewhere, and somehow I followed him out, and he didn't see me. And so whenever he got in the car, I went around behind the car, I guess to get in the other side, I'm not really sure. But he didn't see me, and he started backing out and ran over me. And when he backed over me, it literally pulled me up into the wheel well and grabbed my scalp on this side and grabbed the hair somehow and pulled me up into the wheel well. And so when it did, it ripped this ear literally completely off. It ripped the scalp from here across to the top of the other ear, and all of this was ripped forward, and all of this skin and scalp was pulled down to eye level. So he heard something, jumped out of the car, looked underneath the car. I was lying there, I wasn't moving. My dad thought I was dead. He started screaming, ran back in the house and started screaming, I killed our baby, I killed our baby. Everybody runs outside to see what's going on. My grandfather came out, saw me. By this time, apparently I was moving around, and he reached under the car and grabbed me and actually got my ear that was laying on the ground next to me and put us in the car, in his truck, a pickup truck. And then we were only about 3 or 4 blocks away from the hospital. And so he drove me right to the hospital, took me right into a doctor. It was a fairly small town, and so it was kind of easy just to get right on in. The doctor took one look at me and said, he can't make it, there's too much damage, just get ready, to bury him. My mom was there, my dad was there, obviously, and other family members. When the doctor said that, my mom, who at that time was the only Pentecostal there, to any degree, everybody else was pretty much Methodist and Nazarene for the most part. Not that that matters, I'm just kind of giving you a history. But my mom, the doctor told her, said he'll die, just get ready. My mom started praying and said, God, I dedicate him to you, he's yours, I'll raise him for you, just let him live. So the doctor was in there working on me. About an hour and a half later, he came out to take a break. I was still in surgery, but he came out to let them know. And he said, it looks like he might actually live, but if he does, he will have so much brain damage that he will be a vegetable the rest of his life. And so he went back in, had told my parents, that they'll have to feed me, clothe me, take care of me, every bit of it. And he went back in to do some more work, and my mom went back to praying. I said, God, that's not good enough. If you're going to let him live, let him be normal. And like I always say, there's still a lot of controversy in my family over whether I'm normal or not, all right? But like I always tell them, if I'm not, leave me alone because it's working for me, all right? So they went back out. The doctor was in there another hour and a half roughly. And then he came back out and he said, we can't really find any signs of brain damage yet. He never passed out and never lost consciousness, so we don't see any signs of brain damage. But even if he does live, and even if he is normal, we've sewn his ear back on, we've closed the scalp up. They had to actually go in and scrape. They had the white shell gravel type stuff, and they had to scrape the scalp because there was this gravel all up inside between my scalp and my skull. And he said, we sewed all that up, but even if he is normal, he will never have any hearing in his right ear, and he will never have any hair. And my mom went back to praying and said, God, that's not good enough. If you're going to let him live, if you're going to let him be normal, fix him. And so I've got perfect hearing, got plenty of hair. I actually just had this cut yesterday, and so because it was a lot longer. And so I've had hair, down to my shoulders at points, so it has grown. I do have a good scar on the backside. And for years, even up until I was about 25, the strangest things would happen because I would just, just kind of scratch my head and I'd feel something. And how something just bothers you and you just kind of keep, you know how parents are, quit picking at it, quit picking, just leave it. Well, I just keep messing with it, and finally it would break through the skin, and I'd look at it and it would be a piece of shell that was left over there. So, as my wife is so fond of saying, I still had rocks in my head, even at 25. And actually at one point, some of the rock even got down into an earlobe. And I don't know how it did it, but it's like it worked its way all the way down. And I just kept messing with it until I finally broke it to the skin and, it's a piece of rock. And so it's funny because my mom just recently was going through a bunch of stuff. My dad passed away a year ago, a little over a year ago, almost 2 years ago now. And it's funny because she was going through all this stuff and kind of separating stuff. and she found all of the, should have brought them out, I didn't even think about it. I got them back in my file cabinet. All of the head bandages and stuff that they used, like they had this wraparound wrap thing, all that's back there, and from that time, still has, dry blood on it, the whole bit. I mean, and she didn't wash it. They put it in this bag, and it's like, don't touch it, So I got all that stuff back there. But it had, this doctor came out and said, for years we'd walk down the street and he would see me and he'd call me over and look at my head and go, yep, look, it's going to be okay. Doctor, I'm 8 years old. If it ain't going to work, it would have been before now, okay? So, but we, so I had all this damage, still got a good scar, like I said, on the back and all that. But my mom, after that, anytime there was anything going on, I mean, I didn't start school right away. My parents were both young, like I said, and they kept me at home. I was, treated fairly special because they didn't want me out of their sight. I mean, it was just like anything going on. You hear a car hit its brakes, and the first thing everybody in the family did is, where's Curry? Just like it's going to happen again, And so my mom, my dad worked at a newspaper at that time before he became a policeman, but he would work nights. And so my mom would sit up at night and she would read to me using the King James Bible. And so when I didn't start school right away, she taught me how to read by using the King James. And so by the time I started school, I'd already read through the King James with her. I think she said four or five times that we'd just gone through it. And all that time just putting it in me. In the early days, she read me to sleep reading the Bible. And then later on, I started reading it to her and read her to sleep, basically. And, again, like I always tell everybody, I told her not too long ago, I said, I'm still putting people to sleep by reading the Bible. So, but it just, it got in me, I was, it was some time before I realized that these and thous and all the, shout and all that kind of stuff is not normal English. I mean, to me, it was just kind of like I was raised on it. And so when I read the King James, I don't have to decipher it. I just read it and I understand it. And so, and didn't know it at the time, but God was using all that to just put it in me. And so I knew scriptures that I didn't know. And so things would come out, and I didn't always know where they were, but I knew they were there, and I knew, and the good thing was I knew it in King James, so it was easy to find using a Strong's Concordance. So it made it a little bit easier. So by that time, coming up about, my dad became a policeman when I was 9, and we moved in across the street from this little Nazarene church, as a matter of fact. And on one Sunday morning, my parents would work, but my dad would be home, and so my mom would go to work. My dad would come home. He worked nights, and so he'd go to sleep. That's pretty much, he was there, but I was pretty much by myself. And so my mom would be getting up, getting ready to go to work, and she'd put on the television, and I would sit there and watch Catherine Kuhlman, Oral Roberts, Morris Cerullo, and I remember Ernest Angley. I don't know if y'all remember Ernest Angley or not. He was world famous for saying, baby, baby, just say baby. We're talking about trying to get people, deaf people to hear. And so I was raised watching all those people. I thought, well, that's, I thought Oral Roberts, he was pretty cool. Catherine Kuhlman, she was strange. And I thought, she just kind of scared me, because the way she acted so weird and spooky and all that kind of stuff. And so one point, I knew there was a church across the street, so I walked across the street and sat there, and when the pastor gave the altar call, walked down front and got saved, 9 years old. From that time on, I knew God was with me. Didn't know how to walk with God, didn't know any details, but I knew He was with me. I knew He'd saved my life. And then roughly at 17, knew that I was called, at 17, I was trying to follow my father's footsteps, and I was going into the military. I was going to be a police officer. I already had my whole life kind of planned out. I was going to go into the military and then become a police officer later on. And when I went into the military, went in as security police, law enforcement specialist, went in Air Force. And while I was in there, after a short period of time, they came over and said they took volunteers for pararescue. So I volunteered for pararescue and went into it. And during that whole time, I knew He was with me. And I was reading my Bible. I was an only child, away from home first time, feeling kind of lonely and all that, and just started reading. And just reading the Bible. And I'd read, they laid hands on the sick, and, the deaf heard, and the blind saw. And I thought, where is that? Why? Because I was raised, it's funny, in the early days, I was raised more or less Pentecostal, but because of my dad's police job, we pretty much fellowshipped around the Southern Baptist Church, because that was kind of the church you went to, It was good for making business contacts and that kind of stuff. And so I was raised Southern Baptist, but I had strong Pentecostal understandings at that point. And so I kept reading. I thought, where is that? Because I sure hadn't seen it in my church. And eventually, at one point, finally, sometime later, they came down and said, we have too many people in this field. If you want to get out of this field, you can either go into another branch or you can get a full honorable discharge and get out. And I'm like, I'm gone. I had prayed. That was on February 10th. The reason I'm saying is because this time is coming up and I remember it every year. I prayed on February 10th. I said, God, if you want me to preach, you want me to get out of here, you've got to get me out because I have a guaranteed enlistment. I'm here for 6 more years. I said, I cannot get out. So if you want me to go preach, you got to get me out. That was on February 10th. On the 13th was whenever our commanding officer came down and said, anybody that wants out, here's your chance. I said, that's me. And so it's actually a bunch of other people there too. But I got out, went home to my parents. I'm called to preach. It's funny, my dad cried, my mom laughed. She said, I knew it was going to come to this. She said, I knew you were going to do this sooner or later, and I knew God was going to call you. And so, but she said, I wanted God to call you and not me to call you. And so, but she said, I knew God was going to call you because I dedicated you to him. So my dad said, well, if that's what you're going to do, then we'll get you in seminary. We'll send you to Dallas Theological Seminary, and we'll put you in there. And that way, I said, I ain't got time for that. I said, I've got to talk to people on the street. I got to witness. I got to preach on the street. He said, but nobody will let you in your churches, in their churches, if you don't get a degree and don't become a minister. And I said, I'm not trying to get in their churches. I'm trying to help people on the street. And he didn't understand at that point because, he's military and, police oriented and, there's certain ways to do things. And so luckily, I did not go through DTS, okay? It would have been a whole lot more unlearning I had to do. So at that point, shortly after that, within a year after that, we got married. I married my wife, and about a year after that, we had our first child. And when our first daughter was born, her name was Erica, and she was born with a hemangioma tumor. And there was no sign of it before the birth. Sonograms and all that kind of stuff, no sign of it. But when she was born, the tumor that she had, a hemangioma tumor is a tumor made up of a bunch of blood vessels that are kind of in a ball, okay? And when she was born, it was, pretty dramatic to everybody. Nobody expected it. And what made her special was that it was where it was at. A lot of people have hemangioma tumors. Hers was in her tongue, which made her tongue about the size of my fist when she was born, which made it almost about half the size of her head. And so her tongue was outside of her mouth, and there was this huge, and it kind of looked like a tongue, but at the same time it was this purplish and blue, and literally it looked like a thin bag over a bunch of snakes because it was in, and it moved inside. You could see it, from these blood vessels moving around. And so we had no clue. We didn't know anything about it, anything. I knew God had healed me, but I didn't know anything about healing at all. And so immediately, and she was born up in Sherman, Texas, and the doctor and all of us, we got in a plane, and they flew her down to John Seeley Hospital in Galveston. They put her in intensive care. She was in intensive care for 6 months. Ran up a $186,000 bill, which is pretty cheap for 6 months in intensive care, but this was back in 1978, sorry. And so during that time, I was working up here, had to go down there every weekend. My wife had to stay there in the hospital with her. There was no place for her to stay at that time. She would have to pull chairs together in the waiting room. For 6 months, she lived in a waiting room. And I would go down every weekend, and I had to come back up here and go to work. I was working at Texas Instruments at the time, up in the Sherman area. And so I would go back and forth on the weekends and stay down there and then have to come back again. And we'd be down there, and in the middle of the night, somebody would run out of the emergency room or the ICU screaming because their baby had died in the middle of the night, and they would drop on the floor and beat their fist. God, why'd you take my baby? God, why'd you? And I knew all this, but I didn't know. I just knew that wasn't right. I couldn't see God doing that. And so roughly 6 months later, at the end of 6 months, we got her out of the hospital on my birthday. And they came down and said, if you want to get your daughter out, you have to sign these papers, and we have to find some way for you to pay the bill. I didn't have insurance, didn't have money, had no way to pay the bill. And so we started praying and said, God, we got to do, they're holding my child hostage. I can't get her until we pay the bill. And so the Crippled Children's Fund came down and said, if you will let us put her case in the AMA Medical Journal, we will cover all your bills. And we said, done. And so we got her out, and she's in the American Medical Association Journal because she was the only child where the tumor was born that had a tumor where it was. And so it made her case kind of special because they really couldn't do anything about it. Most tumors they can remove, cut out, something. They couldn't hers. And so doctors told us that if they had to do a tracheotomy because her tongue was so large it would cover her breathing passage and she would suffocate, so they did put a tracheotomy in her. That my wife had to go through medical classes to learn how to cleanse all that and do all that stuff. So during that time, the doctor said if she ever grows teeth, she will bite into this tumor, it will cut into the tumor, and she will die. If you ever live more than 5 minutes away from a hospital, if she cuts her tongue, she'll bleed to death before you get there. And so over and over again, we had times where we'd walk into the room and she had cut her tongue on something that you would think, you couldn't cut, but she would just cut her tongue and there'd be blood everywhere. And we'd grab her and take a hand towel and put on her tongue and jump in the car and drive. And we lived out in the Van Alstyne area at that time, which is a little bit more than 5 minutes away from the hospital. And we'd put on, and by this time we'd both received the baptism of the Spirit. We'd just start praying in tongues. When we got her to the hospital, they would take the towel off of her tongue and look at it and say, well, we don't see any cut, but it looks like it might have been a scar, but this looks like it's at least 2 weeks old. And so that happened like 5 or 6 different times, that she would just be almost completely healed before we got there. We could do that. We just couldn't get rid of this tumor. And so we started going to this little full gospel church. And when I walked in the door, told the pastor that I was called to minister. Actually, before that, I went to a Free Will Baptist church and told the pastor there I was called to minister. And being in the Air Force, all I could have was a mustache. They wouldn't let us have anything else. And I still had my mustache, and the pastor said, well, God won't ever use you as long as you have facial hair. You got to shave all that, and God can't use you. And so I walked out of that church and never went back, okay? Because I realized if that preacher thought that, then, he was dumber than a bag of nails. But anyway, I thought if facial hair can stop the power of God, then we're all in big trouble. All right? So I left there, and we found this little full gospel church, and way out in the middle of the country. It was the closest thing to an Azusa Street church I'd ever seen. It was amazing. You get out in the parking lot, and the singing's going, and it was amazing. Went in, talked to the pastor. The pastor had actually been and the reason my dad started going there was because my dad was a policeman, and the pastor there was an ex-Houston police officer who had also been the pilot for the Happy Hunters. So he knew a little bit about healing. And so when I got there, he gave me my first E.W. Kenyon book and my first Kenneth Copeland cassette tape. And so I got that stuff, and I'm listening. I'd never heard anything like that. And I put that on, and I thought, man, where has this been? I mean, so I'm one of those people, I'm 100% or nothing. I mean, I either get in or get out, one or the other. But I don't play with stuff. It's either all or nothing. And so I figured out right then, I got to find this stuff. And so I started doing the research and finding out where these guys were and going to the camp meetings, and everything was healing. I was trying to get my daughter healed. And we'd see results, and the tumor was actually getting smaller. We just couldn't get it to happen quick enough. So then finally on February 13th, again, that day kept coming up several times in my life. February 13th, 1981, Erica passed away. What killed her was not the tumor, but she'd actually developed double pneumonia. And she died overnight. Actually, we called the hospital and told the doctor what was going on. My wife had actually called him and talked to him. And he said, well, just keep her cool and come in the morning, because they'd called her about 11 or 12 at night. And the doctor didn't want to come in. He said, so bring her in the morning. Well, in the morning, she was dead. And so that was on Friday the 13th, February 1981. They didn't know what to do with it. They said, listen, with this tongue and the tumor the way it is, we either have to remove that, and if you remove it, then we can wait a while till we have the funeral in time for everybody to come in. If we don't remove it, you're going to have to bury her quick, because we don't know what's going to happen. And I said, well, this is the way she came into the world, so we're not removing it. And so they said, well, we need to do the funeral quick. So we actually had her funeral the next day, which was Saturday, February 14th, which is Valentine's Day. And so it kind of tainted that day for us, as we remembered each year. And so the thing is, though, her tongue was always outside of her mouth for the most part. And she got to where she could actually put it back in, but it was made her mouth very full. It wasn't easy, and she couldn't do it all, very long because it took effort to pull it back in and keep it in. So my wife's grandmother made a little bonnet and put this thing that could go around her tongue that would kind of hold her tongue, and it was almost like a little mask. And that way, because when you took her out, people would see her, and if they shouldn't have that on, they would act very bad. And it was shocking, so I made allowances for it. But you could tell too if we were pushing her in the stroller, and she would have this thing on, and you take her in the mall, and she didn't like it on, and she would pull it off, and we could tell when she did because of how people would respond. And as a young couple, first child, it's not supposed to be that way. Your first baby, every baby should be a good time to remember. We never got to hold our daughter until she was 6 months old. She was in an ICU in a little incubator. They had to put tubes in her ribs. Her lungs collapsed. They had to put tubes in to pump the lungs back up. They had to put the trach in. She died a couple of times in there. They were able to resuscitate her. All this, it's just one thing after another. And here we are, in our late teens, early 20s. And so we're going along, and I'll never forget because in 1980, now I know I'm kind of back and forth here, but in 1980, we were out here in Wiley, Texas. And I was working at the water department, and at that point, they actually shut down a part of it, so I lost my job. We were trying to figure out what to do. God worked a lot of miracles. He actually brought us a vehicle and a camper trailer, and so we were going to go to camp meeting. We were going to go to Tulsa and go to the Kenneth Hagin camp meeting. And so we launch out, we go up there, go to the camp meeting, miracle after miracle. The whole year was just nothing but miracles. I've talked about it before. I don't have time to talk about it now. The whole year, amazing. We went down to Sulphur, Louisiana, and helped plant a church there. And when we left, there was about 350 people in it. It was growing. It was good. We came back to Texas. But when we went down there, we would go out on the streets every Friday night, just walk down one side of the main drag of that city and just witness to people and pray for people. And then we'd turn around and come back up the other side, and we'd grab all these people together and we'd say, come with us. We're going to go back here, and we're going to pray here. We're going to preach here. So come back up to the building, to this house with us. It was an apartment complex, actually. And so we take them back into this apartment. We had everybody in the front living room, and it kept growing, so we had to start taking the furniture out just so people could sit in there. And then, so the kids, we put them upstairs, and all the visitors' kids and everybody else, they'd all go upstairs, and so our daughter was up there with them. And she was almost 3 years old by this point, 1980, roughly 2, a little over 2. And so, we'll never forget it because I was preaching one night, and I heard some screaming upstairs. And I had a preaching partner that traveled with me, and I let Bill, his name was Bill Schultz, he took over, and I said, you need to take over, I need to go upstairs, see what's going on. So I went upstairs, and he took over the preaching. When I went up there, it was one of those defining moments, because when I went into the room, the little girl that was screaming was one of the visitors' children. And what had happened was my daughter had pulled her bonnet thing off, okay? And it scared the little girl, which is understandable. And it scared her, and she started screaming. But when I walked in the door, what got to me was when I walked in the door, my daughter she'd pulled it off, the girl had started screaming, and my daughter recognized, it was the first time I knew that she was different. Because when I walked in the room, she had turned away from the little girl and tried to cover her tongue with her arm. And that just isn't right. Amen. And I'll never forget it, because no child should ever feel ashamed for how they look. Amen. Especially when they don't have anything to do with it. And so it just really, it hit. And so we kept going after healing, and we were getting results. It was getting there. But then she passed away before we got it done. And I was doing everything I was taught to do. I had the best teaching on healing at the time that there was. I went after it, and we did everything they told us. And she'd been prayed for by everybody. Everybody, all the name evangelists, and they all knew us, because they all knew us because of Erica. And they'd all prayed for her. And again, some good results, but not enough. So when we buried her on February 14th, actually right up here in McKinney, just south of McKinney, there's a cemetery on the left-hand side of the road, on the west side of the road. And it's called Restland, I think it is. And she was one of the first babies buried in their Babyland section. And when we stood there at that grave that morning, I'll never forget it, because whenever I heard, as soon as I knew she was dead, my first thought was, okay, we'll call people. We'll call all these people we've been listening to. We'll call them. Somebody can raise the dead. Somebody can do it. And so I called every major ministry, tried to get through to them, couldn't get a hold of them, couldn't reach them. So finally, whenever we stood at that cemetery that day, and the little white casket, they were putting it down on the ground. They try to get you to kind of walk away before they do that. But as that casket went down, everybody else had gone off. Me and my wife stood there. And I remember because I looked at that casket and I said, God, there was no man for me when I needed one. Amen. But if you will teach me, I'll be that man for somebody else. So that nobody else ever has to have a grave on my watch. So we stood there till she was buried. Most of our family thought, what's going to happen now? What are they going to do? Well, we're going to turn from God, turn away from God, blame God, because that's what they thought. They didn't know what we'd been hearing. But I'll tell you, I thank God for the Word of Faith teaching that I had gotten at that point. Now, there's excesses like there isn't anything else. But like Kenneth Hagin used to say, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And we learned a lot of good stuff, right? And very honestly, I had good influences in the middle of that because we've raised all of our children now on Keith Green music, on Steve Camp, on even some of the Carmen and some of that stuff. And if it wasn't for Keith Green and some of the Steve Camp, I probably would have fallen prey to a lot of the Word of Faith excesses on finances. But Keith Green, and again, I don't agree with all of his theology, but I agree with his heart. Amen. And his heart came through his message and through his songs. And he taught me that everything that I've got goes to God. Everything I've got belongs to God and is to be used for God. And so it was never a matter of using faith to get. It was using faith so that we had to give. It was using faith to be able to help people. And I knew that whatever I heard had to come out my mouth. I couldn't just keep it to myself. And so because of that, I knew God didn't take my baby. I knew that God didn't kill my baby. I knew it was the devil that took my baby. I knew it was the devil that stole her life. And then people say, well, you're saying that your baby's in hell. No, just because the devil kills somebody doesn't mean he has the right to put him in hell. No, right? And so I knew where my daughter was. And so at that point, we just got even more forceful. And we started searching more and more. And I'd heard about Smith Wigglesworth, amazing miracles. I'd heard about Amy Semple McPherson. And then I heard about John Lake. And of all the people that I studied or that I heard of, John Lake was the only one that reproduced himself on a regular basis. He actually trained men and women to get the results that he got. And so I'd been in martial arts from the time I was 9 years old at that point. And I knew that you can find a good fighter, doesn't make him a good teacher. And you can find a good teacher that isn't necessarily a good fighter. But when you can find a fighter that's a good teacher, that's the one you want to study under. And so that's what when I saw John Lake, I said, this man, he didn't just teach it. He knew it, he could do it, and he taught it. And so I said, I need to get a hold of him. Well, I didn't know he was dead. And so I started searching, couldn't find out. Then I realized that he died in 35. So then I started searching around for the next best thing, which was his family. And so finally, eventually, I found Gertrude and Wilford Wright, his daughter and his son-in-law. And they were living in Kennewick, Washington at that time. And actually, we're right here at Christ the Nations, speaking at Christ the Nations. And so I made contact with them, and then I called out there and started talking to them. And then for the next 6 years, roughly, almost 7 years, every Monday, I would call to their house. And they would answer. Usually Gertrude would answer. And I remember the first time I actually had this on, I recorded all those conversations. That was back when you had the landline phones. And you had to put the little suction cup thing on the back that connected to your cassette recorder. And so I would record all the conversations. You can hear the phone ringing, and you can hear her when she answers. And I said, is Wilford right there? And she said, well, he's out in the backyard playing with the grandchildren. And I said, well, are you Gertrude? And she said, yes. I said, well, actually, I can talk to you if you don't mind. And we just started talking. And then eventually he came in, and we started talking with him. And every Monday, I would call him with this list of questions. And I said, how did John Lake believe? How did he pray? What did he say? When he prayed, how did he pray? All these questions. They would answer them. Then I'd spend the rest of the week looking up the answers in the Bible, making sure what they were saying was biblical. And by the next Monday, I had a whole new set of questions. And so we did this for 7 years. Now, there was a couple of weeks in there that they would travel and different things. In '83, they went to South Africa, so I didn't talk to them for about a month or so. But overall, for about 7 years, we just stayed in contact. Well, finally in 86, 87. Yeah, November of 86, 87. Yeah, trying to remember the right days. Gertrude actually passed away. And I could tell by Will's voice that he probably wasn't going to last long because they were just too close. And he started talking to me about how he and Gertrude had talked. And he said, well, what is your testimony? And I said, well, I got hit by a car when I was 17 months old. He said, well, when was that? And I said, well, 17 months old, I guess it's been about 1960 or so. What day? I'm like, I don't know. I mean, what day? I mean, nobody ever told me the day. I said, I don't know. He said, well, can you find out? I said, yeah, I can ask my mom. She might know. And he said, well, find out and get back with me. And I thought, well, that's just weird. Why would he need to know the day? And so I called my mom. I said, Mom, is there a way you can find out what day I got ran over? And she said, yeah, that was September 16th, 1960. I said, why, you know that? She goes, yeah, some days you just don't forget. And I thought, yeah, because I remembered Erica, and I'm thinking, yeah, that's true. Some days you'll never forget. And so I called Will back up, and I said, that was September 16th, 1960. He said, yeah, I thought so. And I thought, what do you mean you thought so? He said, well, I want to read something to you. He said, Gertrude and I had talked about this, and we were wondering about it. He said, of all the people that had contacted us about Dr. Lake, he said, you're the only person that never asked me how to get his anointing. He said, you only asked me what he believed, what he did, how did he pray. You asked me specifics. You never asked about his anointing. He said, why didn't you ever ask me? I said, well, I figured the anointing is up to God. I said, but I figured if I believed like he did, acted like he did, talked like he did, prayed like he did, then I'm a pretty good chance that God would anoint me the way he did him. So he said, well, I want to read to you a prophecy that Dr. Lake gave on May 24th, 1934. And so then he started to give this prophetic word. He started to read this to me. And in it says that the person that would be picking up the ministry would be born the year the country quit growing, which was 1959. The last state was added to the Union. And he said, and that it would be 25 years to the day of his death. Now this was him prophesying this. 25 years from the day of my death, this young man, Satan will try to kill this young man. And it was 25 years to the day of his death, September 16th, 1935. 25 years later was September 16th, 1960, the day I got hit by the car. And so he said, because of that, we feel like you are the person that's supposed to pick this up. So he said, I'm going to start sending you all the material, different things we've got. He sent me letters. He sent me photographs, names. They had over 100 names of people that had sat under Dr. Lake's ministry. So I started calling all these people. This was back in the early 80s. I mean, I was studying the Bible. I never took a job that would pay good, that was based on a career. I took jobs where I could work nights that didn't involve a lot of activity so that I could sit and study. And so I would go to work and sit there and study the Bible, and had a friend that worked at the water department. We'd get on the phone for like 6 hours straight, talking on the phone, Bible study. And we'd go through all this stuff and dig this stuff out. And so during that time, I started calling all these people. I didn't have money. I didn't have any money to do these things. And I was running up over a $400 a month phone bill, calling all these people and trying to track these people down. And my wife said, can we afford this? I'm like, we got to. I got to know this. I got to get to this. I got to get these answers. And so we kept searching, kept studying. And then finally, and there's a lot of events happened. Actually, eventually on, Memorial Day in May of 1989. Now, by this time, my first daughter died. We'd had our second son. He was born in March of 1980. Then when Erica died in February of 81, everybody thought we was going to turn away from God. Instead, we said, nope, God's going to replace her. He's going to give us another child, identical twin, perfectly healthy. You watch. 9 months later, Crystal was born. Identical twin of Erica, even though they never saw each other. Wow. Amazing. Even the mannerisms, amazing. I had people in my wife's family said, man, that makes you believe in reincarnation, doesn't it? And I said, no, it makes me believe in a good God. We believed we got exactly what we got. And we got exactly what we believed for. And then after that, of course, our fourth child, my third daughter, last child, Rebecca was born. Well, when Rebecca was 7 in 1989, Labor Day, or Memorial Day, sorry, we were right over here on in Garland at a apartment, and the kids were playing. I was downstairs sitting by the patio window, and somehow Rebecca leaned against a window and fell out of a second-story window. And she fell roughly 32 feet, landed head first on concrete. When I heard, I didn't know what happened, but I heard something hit, and I didn't know what it was. But I went out to see what was going on. When I opened the door, she was lying face down where she had tried to catch herself, and her hands were still actually there. And she was face down. Her nose was smashed. Her teeth had cut through her upper lip. Her face was all banged up. When I picked her up, I turned over and picked her up. There was blood in her mouth. There was no heartbeat. There was no breath. There was nothing. She was dead. When I picked her up, all of a sudden, I kept hearing. It was like immediately I saw that first funeral of my first daughter all over again, relived the whole thing. And I kept hearing in my head, you're going to lose another one. You're losing another one. You're going to bury another one. And I just kept hearing that over and over again in my head. And I saw that whole funeral in a split second. But because of the teaching I had received, I never said anything other than, in the name of Jesus, you will live and not die. Amen. In the name of Jesus, you will live and not die. And I started saying over and over and loud. Now, she was already dead. So it made no sense to say you will live and not die. She was already dead. But the Word of God says you can call those things which be not as though they were. The Word of God does not say call those things which are as though they're not. Right? I wasn't saying you're not dead, you're not dead. I was saying you will live and not die. And after roughly 20, 25 minutes of walking around on the patio with her in my arms, her head's back, arms back, no, I'm still nothing. I'm walking around screaming at the top of my lungs, in the name of Jesus, you'll live and not die, because I was trying to get over the voice in my head telling me I was going to bury her. And after 25 minutes of nothing, I went back into the house, still carrying her. I set her down up against a wall, propped her up against the wall. Her head was dropped way down on her chest. Her arms were down by her side, and she was just propped up against the wall, still dead, blood draining out of her mouth, no heartbeat, no breath. My wife and the other kids come running down the stairs, hearing what's going on, and everybody's panicking. And so I'm down on my knees in front of her, and I start pointing my finger and I start yelling again, in the name of Jesus, you will live and not die. You will live and not die. About 45 minutes from the time she fell out of the window, she's sitting with her head down, and it was just like someone punched her in the stomach, because she jerked, or maybe it was like someone had put defibrillators on her, because she just jerked. And when she jerked, she spewed blood all over me. I had on a yellow pullover shirt, and she spewed blood all over me, and she opened her eyes, and we sat there, and then all of a sudden we got quiet, because now we're watching this, and we watched her start to focus, and it was like you could see her coming back. And as soon as she got kind of totally focused, now remember there's blood in her mouth, her nose is smashed, she's got a tooth sticking through her lip. And she's sitting there, and the first thing she says is, Daddy, I'm hungry. First thing she said. Now, we just happened to have some pita bread over on the stove that had been frozen, and we were defrosting it. And so I went and I peeled a piece off and took it to her, and I knew she couldn't eat. I mean, her mouth was too messed up. But I gave her that bread, we put it in her mouth, and then I picked her up, and that was the first thing we thought of. Now we take her to the hospital. That never entered our mind the first time, because the last time we had a dead baby and they took her to the hospital, we didn't see her again until she was ready to be buried. And I had made a commitment. God gave those kids to me. They're my responsibility, and I will not turn that over to anybody else. And so we had plenty of incidents, but we took her to the hospital right over here on Walnut, Walnut right here in Garland, on Clara Barton Avenue is what it's called, as a matter of fact. And we found some pictures the other day of her lying there. Both of her wrists had been broken in the fall where she tried to stop herself. Her knee had been crushed, and they put a cast on it. And finally they said they did put things on her head and things on her heart, and said that they could tell by these patterns that she'd been dead, clinically dead, they said, at least 45 minutes. And so then apparently everything returns to normal over a period of time, and they can tell that stuff. I don't know. But so from that time, now that was in 89, 87, 89, yeah, 89. And so by this time, I'd already started getting the stuff from Will. Now, Will actually passed away in 88, so by this time he was gone, but I had a list of names. I started calling all these people and trying to find these people that had been under Dr. Lake. I had a set of questions that I asked the same questions to every person. because I figured if I asked the same questions to every one of them, then I would listen to the answers, and the things that I heard the same, I would know that'd be true. And then the other things could be true, but who knows for sure. So the only thing I could go by really was the thing I heard from all of them. So I called all these people, interviewed all of them, well over 100 people, and started gathering all this information, put it together. So eventually in 95, we heard about this woman named Pauline Parham, which was Charles Parham's daughter-in-law. She was going to be preaching down in Alvin, Texas. So my son and I, we started to go down there. And actually we were on our way at one point to open up another martial arts school. I was still teaching martial arts at the time. And as I was driving, God spoke to me. And he said, how long are you going to pursue something that has an end when you can pursue me and I have no end? Wow. And so my son was driving, or I was driving, he was riding, and I woke him up, and he was asleep. And I told him, I said, this is what God just said. And he said, okay, well, what are you going to do? I said, I don't know. I mean, that was my livelihood. I didn't know what else to do. And so I drove a little bit further, and God spoke again. He said, you're using your hands to teach people to kill. I want to use your hands to teach people to heal. So I remembered when I stood at my daughter's grave and asking him to teach me. So I told my son again, and he said, what are you going to do? I said, I can't do this anymore. So we turned around, came back to Dallas, shut down my schools, heard about this woman going to be preaching down in Alvin, Texas, which is right outside of Houston. We went down there, I videotaped her preaching, talked to her, met with her. Come to find out she lived at Christ for the Nations right here in Dallas. And I thought, well, that's going to be convenient. And so while I was down there, I had a list of names of people who had been in Houston in Dr. Lake's church. So I went over to find them, and usually I found them, many of them I found in the graveyard, but there were always some that were still living. And so I found this one woman that was still alive. She was in her 90s. She had married the son of the divine healing technician that had come from Spokane down to Houston to help Dr. Lake start his church. So I went in and started talking to her. She was in a nursing home. Went in and started asking her all these questions. By the second day, she was getting really tired of the questions. And finally she just said, you know, if you all your questions be answered if you just had a manual. And I said, well, yeah, that'd be great, but where would I find one of those? She said, well, I have one. You know, and I, you know, in my generation, remember old Red Fox? When those, you know, that's the way I felt, you know. You know, and I thought, you do? I said, can I see it? She said, well, you can see it, but you can't have it till I die. I said, okay. And so they brought it in, and I'm sitting there, and I'm trying to, you know, it's one of those times when you think, why didn't I learn shorthand? You know, because then I could have wrote it all down. But I'm trying to make notes and look at this, and I came back here, and I started praying. I said, God, she's really old. Lord, she's lived a good, long life. Lord, you promised us 70 years. She's 93. She deserves her reward, Lord. She deserves it. So it took me about 2 years to pray her to death. So, and after she died, her family sent me this manual. We were living up in Sherman, so when I got this manual, I started going through this thing. And, I mean, from the first day I got it, I started reading. I'm like, this is everything opposite of what I had been taught. Amen. I mean, I had been taught by the best, and this was the opposite of everything. And I started noticing things, because these were what Dr. Lake used. It's what he taught from, especially from 1918. This was from a 1918 manual. I found out he actually did kind of different revisions over the time, but the one I have was from 1918, which was actually kind of the height of his ministry there at Spokane. And so I was going through these, and I started recognizing some of the names, because I'd had all the John Lake books that were out at that time, and I started recognizing some of the sermons. Well, these were simply just sermons he'd preached. But that's what he used to train his divine healing technicians. And as I studied these things, I started realizing, wait a minute, I've seen that sermon, but I've never seen this. Well, and so I'd get the books, then I'd look at them, and the sermons that I was reading out of this manual were like 4 and 5 and 6 times as long as what I was reading in the books. So I started looking back, and on every book that's put out so far, it always says edited by. And I started realizing that the people that had had these sermons before, they were edited. And so I started reading this. This was unedited. So then I started digging out all of the things that Wolford and them had sent me and realized these were all unedited. Well, I had just seen the titles, so I just assumed they were always the same. So then I started going back and reading them, and the pieces that had been edited out was what was the opposite of what I had been taught.
Wow.
Why? Because at that time, the current teaching, this would have went against that current teaching, and it would have caused controversy, it would have caused some trouble, and probably they may not have sold as they were. But the powers that be at that time pretty much controlled what got released, and so they just edited out all the stuff they didn't like. And so I started reading this, and it was the edited out parts that I started doing that worked.
Wow.
And we started getting results, and I started praying for people in our home, and for 9 months, everybody that came to our house got healed, didn't matter what it was. And we started commanding instead of begging, instead of asking, instead of believing and receiving. We actually commanded things to happen and seen them happen. And then, and it was, most of it had to do not so much with healing, but who we are in Christ. That was really the essence of it. And so I started looking at these things more and more, and we started doing it more and more. I started getting more out. And then one thing kind of led to another eventually, to where we were traveling, and it just expanded out. And I don't have time to go into it, much deeper. But what we've done, essentially, the DHT and what we teach you is simply the parts that were edited out of the book, the different books you read. And now we're in the process. We've actually found publishers that will actually print these. I have all these. I've got well over 100 sermons that have never been published. And so we're going to start putting that stuff out and putting all these out. But the key to remember is that the current normal teaching is always what benefits who's in power, right? And so really all I started finding out was that all he did was kind of hit the traditions of their day. And their big thing was, does God still heal? Does he use means in healing? Does he heal everyone? Does he always heal? And, question is stuff like things that we should already know, some of which we do, some of which obviously we don't. And so I started looking at these and started getting it deeper and deeper in me, and started standing on these things and started practicing it and started getting results. And as soon as we started getting results, all of a sudden people started calling us. And you'll hear more about that as we go on, because there was particular incidents that we learned certain things by. But all I'm telling you is that because of that, we picked this thing up, we've ran with it, we've stayed true to it. I've proven it by the Bible. What you're going to learn for the next 3 days works. And all I can say is, and I hear it all the time from people that we talk to, it's good to have a gospel that works. Amen. Right? Not one that you have to make excuses for, right, or reasons why it doesn't work. It's good to have one that works. And honestly, the key to it is that you work it. You just do what it says. And the closer you get back to the truth, the more power is released. Not that God is holding it back, but more gets released through you because there's less of you left to hinder it. Amen. All right? So now we're going to break now. It's 12, so we're going to break till 2 o'clock. That should give you plenty of time to eat and fellowship. Right? Shouldn't take you 2 hours to eat. If that's true, we need to pray for you. Okay? should get it done quick, but we want to be able to get back here and get settled in. By 2 o'clock, we'll get started again. Amen? Amen. All right. Y'all get anything out of this so far? Yes, sir. All right. Well, we're gonna pick it back up and run from it. So, all right. God bless you.